The morning the furnace at Hargrove Memorial Hospital broke down in the middle of a January storm, 12 engineers stood in the basement and argued with each other for 4 hours. They had clipboards, they had tablets. 2 of them had flown in from Toronto specifically for this. The hospital's chief of facilities, a man named Gerald Sutton, who had been managing building systems for 22 years, stood in the corner with his arms crossed and said nothing because there was nothing left to say. He had already called everyone worth calling. The pipes feeding the East Wing were at risk of freezing. 43 patients were up there, including 6 in the cardiac recovery unit. The backup heating system had kicked in, but it was struggling. And the engineers kept pointing at different sections of the boiler assembly and disagreeing loudly about which valve was the problem and whether they needed to shut down the entire system to fix it. Nobody noticed the woman mopping the hallway just outside the boiler room door. Her name was Anna Kovacs. She had worked the early morning shift at Hargrove for 11 years, starting at 5:30 every weekday, pushing her cart through the same corridors in the same order, knowing which floors got slippery when the humidity rose and which bathrooms needed extra attention on Mondays after the weekend staff cut corners. She knew this building the way a person knows their own home, not from a blueprint, but from living in it. She had been listening to the engineers for about 20 minutes. She hadn't meant to. She just hadn't finished her section yet. At 7:43, she set her mop against the wall, walked to the door of the boiler room, and knocked on the frame. Gerald looked up. The engineers looked up. One of them, young, with a lanyard from a university Anna didn't recognize, looked back down at his tablet almost immediately. "The pressure release on the secondary intake," Anna said. "Third one from the left. It's been making a sound for about 2 weeks. Like a hiss, but only when the system kicks over from standby. I noticed it when I cleaned down here Tuesday. Nobody said anything." She pointed that one. Gerald walked over. He crouched down, put his hand near the valve. Even from across the room, if you were listening for it, you could just barely hear it. What happened in the next 6 minutes was something Gerald Sutton would describe differently depending on who was asking. To the hospital board, he would say a maintenance observation led to the identification of the fault. To his wife, sitting at their kitchen table that evening, he would say a cleaning lady solved in 2 minutes what 12 engineers couldn't solve in 4 hours, and that he felt ashamed of himself for not asking her sooner. Nathaniel Hargrove did not hear about Anna Kovacs until 3 weeks later. He heard about a lot of things late. That was one of the costs of running 4 companies across 2 provinces. By the time information reached him, it had usually been filtered, summarized, and stripped of anything that might make him uncomfortable. He had people for that. He had people for most things. Hargrove Memorial was one of 3 hospitals in his family's charitable portfolio. His grandfather had built the original building in 1961. Nathaniel had never particularly wanted to be involved in hospital administration, but the board seat came with the name, and the name came with everything else. He was 41 years old and had been described in 2 separate magazine profiles as relentlessly capable and difficult to get close to. Both were accurate. He had the kind of face that looked like it was waiting for something to be wrong, and a habit of arriving at meetings, already knowing the answer to questions nobody had asked yet. His assistant, a careful man named Philip, had worked for him for 6 years and still occasionally flinched when Nathaniel's phone went to voicemail. He heard about the boiler room because he was doing a quarterly review of facilities incidents. And Gerald Sutton's report flagged it as a near miss: 43 patients, 6 in cardiac recovery, a temperature drop that could have been catastrophic. "Resolved," the report said through a staff observation. Nathaniel read that twice. He called Gerald directly, which Gerald clearly did not expect because the man fumbled his phone twice before answering. "The observation," Nathaniel said. "What staff member?" Gerald told him. There was a pause. "A custodian," Nathaniel said. "Yes, sir. She identified a faulty valve that 12 engineers missed." "Yes, sir. She said she'd been hearing it for about 2 weeks." Another pause. "Does she know how close it was? What could have happened?" "I don't think I explained the full extent of it to her. No." Nathaniel hung up and asked Philip to arrange a visit to the hospital the following Tuesday. Anna was cleaning the 3rd-floor corridor when the elevator doors opened and a man walked out who didn't belong there. She could always tell. It wasn't about the clothes, though his coat was clearly expensive. It was about the way he moved, like someone who expected the hallway to accommodate him rather than the other way around. He was looking at his phone and then looking up and then looking at his phone again, and he walked right past her cart without appearing to register that it was there. She moved the cart before he could clip it with his elbow. He stopped, looked at her. Then at the cart. "Sorry," he said, and he sounded like he meant it, which surprised her. "It's fine," she said, and went back to work. He watched her for a second, longer than was comfortable, and then continued down the hall toward Gerald's office. Anna didn't think about it again until Gerald appeared beside her 20 minutes later looking like he'd swallowed something sideways. "Mr. Hargrove would like to speak with you," Gerald said. She wrung out the mop. "Which Mr. Hargrove?" "The one who owns the hospital." She looked at him. "Gerald, I'm in the middle of—" "Anna," he said it quietly. "Please." The man's name was Nathaniel Hargrove, and he was standing in the middle of Gerald's office looking at the facilities report when she came in. He had put his coat over the back of a chair. Without it, he looked less like someone from a magazine and more like someone who hadn't slept particularly well. He put the report down when she entered. "Mrs. Kovacs," he said. "Mr. Hargrove." She didn't sit down because he hadn't offered and she didn't feel like waiting to be offered. "I wanted to thank you in person," he said, "for what you did 3 weeks ago. I told someone about a noise. You identified a pressure fault that would have disabled the heating system in the East Wing during a cold weather emergency. 6 patients in cardiac recovery." He paused. "I don't know if Gerald explained the full situation to you." "He didn't, but I figured it out when I saw them running up there with extra blankets." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "How did you know it was that valve?" She thought about how to answer that. "I've been cleaning this building for 11 years. I know what it's supposed to sound like. Did anyone ever ask you before? About what you noticed?" The question sat between them differently than she expected. She took a breath. "No." He nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "I'd like to change that." She wasn't sure what that meant and she said so. "I'm setting up a facilities review committee," he said. "I want someone on it who actually works in the building every day, who notices things." He paused. "I want it to be you if you're willing." Anna looked at him. She had worked in that hospital for 11 years and been invisible for most of them. She had submitted 3 maintenance observation forms in 2 years and received no response to any of them. One of the things she had noted was the secondary intake valve. She had submitted that one in October. "I put it in writing," she said. "In October, the noise from that valve. I submitted a form." Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt exactly, more like the specific discomfort of a person who has just realized the system they built is broken in a way that costs something real. "I know," he said. "I found it this morning. It was in a backlog queue that nobody had been reviewing." "Then your committee idea," she said, "is probably not the main problem." He didn't look away. "No, it isn't." She picked up her cleaning supplies from where she'd set them by the door. "I appreciate you coming to say thank you in person. Most people don't bother." She was almost out the door when he said, "The form you submitted in October. You wrote that you'd noticed 3 other things in the building over the past year that you thought were worth looking at." She stopped. "I'd like to see them," he said, "if you'd be willing to show me." It started as a walkthrough. She hadn't planned to spend more than 30 minutes on it. She showed him the drainage issue in the east stairwell that she'd noticed was getting worse every time it rained. She showed him the window seal in room 317 that let in cold air along the bottom, which she'd stuffed with a cloth she'd brought from home because no one had come to fix it. She showed him where the floor tiles in the pediatric wing had started to lift at the corner, imperceptible unless you were the one mopping around them every morning, but a fall risk for anyone with a walker or an IV stand. Nathaniel walked behind her and said almost nothing. He took photos on his phone. Once, when she pointed out the window seal and the cloth she'd put there herself, he stopped walking entirely. "How long has this been like this?" he asked. "Since November." "Which room did you get the cloth from?" She looked at him. "Mine. From home." He stood there for a moment. She couldn't read his expression. Then he took the photo and they kept walking. At the end of the walkthrough, they were standing in the basement near the boiler room door, and she realized it was after 1 in the afternoon, and she hadn't taken her lunch break. "I have to get back," she said. "Of course." He put his phone in his pocket. "Thank you. This has been..." He stopped, started again. I didn't realize how much I didn't know about my own building. Most people don't go looking. Did you ever think about going into facilities management? He asked. It wasn't condescending the way it might have been from someone else. It sounded like a real question. She considered whether to answer honestly. I was an engineering student, she said, at U of A. I finished 2 years before my mother got sick. He waited. She needed care. My sister was 16. Someone had to be home. He didn't say anything right away, which she appreciated. People who said I'm so sorry too quickly always made her feel like they were trying to close the conversation rather than be in it. Did you ever go back? He asked. No, life didn't. She paused. It didn't line up again. He nodded. They stood there for a moment in the hum of the basement machinery. I'm going to fix everything you showed me, he said. All of it. And I'm going to find out how that form ended up in a backlog queue for 3 months. Okay, she said. And I'm going to ask you something, and you can say no. She waited. I'm doing a full operational review of the hospital in February. 3-day process. I'd like you to be part of it. Not as a token participant, as someone who actually contributes. You'd be compensated for your time outside of your regular hours. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? Because you know things that my consultants don't, he said. And because I think I've been listening to the wrong people for a long time. She said she'd think about it, which was the truth. She thought about it on the bus home. She thought about it while making dinner for herself and her younger sister Bia, who was 26 and doing her nursing placement at a hospital across the city. She thought about it while washing dishes, while listening to Bia talk about her day, while lying in bed staring at the ceiling of the apartment they had shared since their mother died 4 years ago. Bia noticed, because Bia always noticed. What happened today, she asked, sitting cross-legged on the couch with her textbook open and not looking at it. Anna told her. Bia was quiet for a moment. Then, and you think you shouldn't do it? I think it's strange. Rich man thanks cleaning lady, suddenly invites her onto a review committee. You identified a fault that 12 engineers missed and also submitted written documentation in October that no one looked at. He's embarrassed and trying to do the right thing, or he wants cover. Looks good to have a frontline worker on the committee. B closed her textbook. Anna, you dropped out of engineering school to take care of me and Mom. You have spent 11 years in that building knowing exactly how it works and submitting forms that nobody read. And someone finally read them. She paused. It's okay to let that be a good thing. Anna didn't say anything. Do it, Bus said. Worst case, nothing changes and you've lost 2 evenings. She emailed Nathaniel's assistant the next morning and said yes. The 3-day operational review was held in the last week of February, in the hospital's main boardroom. There were 6 people around the table. 2 consultants from a healthcare advisory firm in Vancouver, the hospital's chief operating officer, Gerald, Nathaniel, and Anna. The first day, the consultants presented findings from their external assessment. They had good data. They had charts. They talked about supply chain efficiency and patient throughput metrics and something called environmental service optimization, which, as far as Anna could tell, meant figuring out how to get custodial staff to cover more ground in less time. She didn't say anything the first day. She listened. The second day, they started talking about implementing a new cleaning schedule that would reduce overlap hours. Anna looked at the proposed schedule for about 4 minutes and then raised her hand. The overnight shift can't cover the pediatric wing under this model, she said. Not on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Those are the nights the physiotherapy team does late sessions and the hallways are in use until 10. You'd be sending one person to clean a high-traffic area with active patient movement. Someone will get hurt. One of the consultants, the one with the lanyard from a firm Anna, had looked up the night before, smiled patiently. The data shows those corridors have lower foot traffic than. The data shows scheduled sessions, Anna said. It doesn't show the parents who stay late on those nights because they're worried. It doesn't show the kids who can't sleep and walk the hall with a nurse. I've mopped that floor on a Tuesday at 9:15 with 8 people in the corridor. She paused. The data is measuring the wrong thing. The room was quiet. Nathaniel was looking at her. He didn't look surprised. He looked like someone watching something confirm what they'd expected. The consultant looked at his partner, then back at Anna. What would you suggest? She had already written it out the night before, because she'd seen where the discussion was going on day 1. She slid her notes across the table. On the third day, during the lunch break, Nathaniel found her in the hallway outside the boardroom. She had her coffee and was looking out the window at the parking lot and the gray February sky above it. Edmonton in winter was not romantic, it was just cold and flat and real. "You should have been in that room 10 years ago," he said. She looked at him. "I should have been finishing my degree 10 years ago. Is it too late?" She almost laughed. "I'm 34, that's not an answer." She turned back to the window. "I've looked into it. Part-time programs exist. The timing has never been right. What would make the timing right?" She thought about it honestly. Tuition, schedule, flexibility. "Not feeling like I'm abandoning the one stable thing my sister and I have." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The hospital has an employee education fund. It's underused. Most people don't know it exists because it's buried in the HR documentation and nobody has promoted it." He paused. "I found out about it this morning, actually, while I was looking into something else." She looked at him. "Are you telling me about a benefit I'm entitled to?" "I'm telling you about a benefit that exists and that you'd qualify for if you wanted to pursue it." She held her coffee cup. Outside, a car was trying to navigate a patch of ice in the parking lot with mixed results. She watched it until it found traction. "You're very careful," she said, "about how you say things." "I'm trying to be," he said. "I haven't always been." She applied to the part-time engineering technology program at NEN8 in March. She was accepted in April. She told Bia over takeout pad thai at the kitchen table, and Bia started crying before Anna had finished the sentence, which made Anna cry, which meant the pad thai got cold. She kept working her shift at the hospital. She took 2 courses the first semester and learned that 11 years of practical experience meant that some things clicked faster than she expected, and some things required her to sit at the kitchen table until midnight relearning calculus. She didn't see Nathaniel often. He visited the hospital perhaps once a month. When he did, he sometimes came across her in the corridors. He always stopped. He asked how the courses were going. He remembered details. That she'd mentioned her calculus textbook being out of date. That she'd said her sister's nursing placement was ending in June. It was the kind of remembering that required actual attention. And she noticed it, because she noticed most things. One evening in October, almost a year after the boiler room incident, she was finishing her shift when she found a package on her locker. Sealed envelope with her name on it. Inside was a copy of an engineering fundamentals textbook, the current edition, with a note that said, "Thought this might help. NH." She stood in the locker room for a long moment holding it. She texted Bia. "He left me a textbook." Bia texted back, "The man is in trouble." She texted, "Don't." Bia texted, "I'm just saying what I see." She ran into him in the parking lot 2 weeks later, by accident, both of them heading to their cars at the same time after late evenings. It was November and properly cold, the kind of cold that made the parking lot lights look brittle. "How's the new textbook?" he asked. "It's significantly better than the 2009 edition I was using." He smiled. It was a different kind of smile than the controlled expression he wore in boardrooms. "I'm glad." They walked in the same direction for a moment because their cars turned out to be in the same row. She didn't know if that was coincidence and didn't ask. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. Why does this keep happening? You stopping to talk, the textbook, the review committee. I'm trying to understand what you're doing." He stopped walking. She stopped too. The parking lot was quiet, just the low hum of the city and someone scraping ice off a windshield 3 rows over. "I'm not doing anything," he said, and then caught himself. "That's not true. I'm trying to." He stopped again. She had noticed that he did this stopping and restarting, like he was editing himself in real time. "I think about the October form. The one you submitted. If someone had read it and the heating system had never been at risk and I'd never had any reason to look into it, you would have kept mopping that same corridor for another 11 years and nobody would have known." "People do that," she said. "Work without being seen. I know. I hadn't really understood what that meant until..." He stopped. "Until I walked that building with you." She looked at him. His breath was visible in the cold. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Nathaniel," she said, using his name for the first time. "What are you actually trying to say?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to have dinner with you," he said. "Not on behalf of the hospital. Not as a follow-up to anything professional. Just dinner." He paused. "If that's something you'd want." She thought about B's voice saying the man is in trouble. She thought about the cloth she'd brought from home to stuff in a window that nobody else had fixed. She thought about how long she had been in that building, doing the work, noticing the things that needed noticing, filling out forms that went nowhere, and how it had taken a crisis and a near catastrophe to make anyone in a position to change things actually look. And she thought about the way he had listened when she talked, how he had taken photos and asked real questions and come back a month later still remembering what she'd said. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "Dinner," she said. "Yes." He let out a breath. She realized he had been holding it. They went to a quiet Italian place near the river that she would never have picked for herself and loved immediately. They talked for 3 hours. She found out that his grandfather had been an electrician before he built the hospital, which explained something she hadn't been able to place about Nathaniel. The way he actually wanted to know how things worked, not just that they did. She found out he had 2 younger brothers he rarely saw because they'd chosen lives far from the family business, and that he envied them in a way he'd never said out loud to anyone before. She found out he hadn't been to a hockey game since he was 11, which in Alberta she considered a personal failing, and told him so, and he laughed. A real laugh, not a polished one, and said he'd take her up on that as a challenge. She told him about her mother. Not the bare version she usually gave people, but the longer one. Her mother had been a seamstress who had come from Hungary to Edmonton in 1989 and worked every job available to her and still managed to be the most joyful person in any room she entered. Anna had inherited her mother's ability to notice things. Her mother used to say it was the most important skill a person could have. Not intelligence, not talent, but attention. The willingness to actually look. Nathaniel was quiet when she finished. Then he said, "She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was," Anna said. "She would have found you very funny, by the way. Funny in a good way. She liked people who took themselves seriously and then got surprised when life made them reconsider." He looked at her. "Is that what you think happened to me? I think you came to thank a cleaning lady and ended up learning something about your own hospital that cost you quite a bit of pride." She smiled. "Yes." He nodded slowly. She would have been right to find that funny. There was a moment, in February of the following year, that Anna thought about later as the one that changed everything. Though she recognized that by then everything had already changed slowly and without announcement. The hospital was hosting a small ceremony to mark the completion of its facilities renovation. The drainage, the tiles, the window seals, a dozen other things that had been caught and fixed and documented as part of what had quietly become an ongoing process of actual listening. Gerald Sutton, who had aged visibly in a good way since the previous January, gave a short speech. The chief of medicine gave a shorter one. Then Nathaniel stood up. He talked about what the renovation had taught him about the difference between managing a building and understanding one. He talked about the value of the people who were in the building every day. He talked about the October form. And then he said Anna's name. She was sitting in the second row, and she felt the whole room look at her, and she held very still because she had always preferred to be the one watching rather than the one being watched. He said, 11 years of attention and expertise that existed in this building, submitted in writing, and went unread for 3 months. That is a failure of process, but it is also a failure of culture. A failure to believe that wisdom can exist in places we haven't been trained to look for it." He paused. "We're trying to do better. Because of her, we already are." After the ceremony in the hallway, Bea appeared from nowhere. Anna had not known she was coming and hugged her from behind, and Anna stood there being hugged by her sister and looked at the ceiling and breathed. "He said your name," Bea said into her shoulder. "I heard him, in front of everyone. I was there, Bea. Anna, I know," she said. "I know." It was a Sunday morning in April when Nathaniel appeared at the door of the apartment she and Bea shared, holding coffee from the place 2 blocks over that Anna had mentioned exactly once, 4 months ago. Bea opened the door, took one look at him, took one look at the coffee, said, "I'm going to the library," and was gone within 90 seconds. He came in. They sat at the kitchen table. Outside, April was doing what April did in Edmonton, trying its best and not quite getting there yet. A thin layer of snow still on the ground, but the light coming back. "I have something I want to say," he said, "and I'm going to say it plainly because I've been careful about words for long enough." She held her coffee. "Okay." "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for a while. I didn't say anything sooner because I was worried about the imbalance. My name on the building, your name on the employment roster, and I didn't want you to feel pressured into anything. But I also think that staying quiet out of caution has kept me from saying true things for most of my adult life, and I don't want to do that anymore. She looked at him. That's it, he said. That's what I wanted to say. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something optimistic in the direction of spring. You were right to be careful, she said. The imbalance is real. I know. I need you to understand that I'm not going anywhere with my program. I'll finish the degree, I know. I'd be disappointed if you didn't, and I make my own decisions. About everything. I wouldn't want it any other way. He said it simply, without performance. I have spent a year watching you notice things that everyone else walked past. I am not interested in changing how you work. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window at an angle that made everything look slightly more hopeful than usual. She thought about her mother, who had come to a new country with very little and paid attention to everything and found joy anyway. She thought about 11 years of knowing a building better than the people who owned it. She thought about the October form, sitting in a backlog queue for 3 months until someone finally read it. Someone finally read it. I love you too, she said. I've been waiting to see if you'd just say it or keep being careful forever. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, but the way a building settles after a long winter. Something releasing. How long? He asked. She thought about the parking lot in November, the textbook, the dinner where he'd laughed for real. Long enough, she said. She got up to refill her coffee, and he followed her to the kitchen counter, and they stood there together while Edmonton tried its best outside the window. The snow retreating by centimeters, the light doing what light always does eventually, finding its way in through whatever gaps it can.